Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. Sorry about the tech issues. So my name is Dr. Joanna Martin. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Cardiff University at the Wolfson Centre for Young People's Mental Health. And today's webinar is about understanding ADHD in children and how to support them at school. So this is an outline of my talk. It's ADHD Awareness Month, which is October, so a good time to be talking about ADHD. So I'm going to start with giving a background about ADHD so we make sure everyone's on the same page, thinking about the importance of diagnosis and support, and also some of the research emerging from my research team looking at underdiagnosis in girls and young women. Next, I'll talk about how to recognize ADHD, focusing on primary school age children. This will obviously be relevant to older children as well. And I'll also be thinking about differences in girls and boys in terms of how ADHD looks. Then I'll move on to thinking about some tips for supporting children with ADHD in primary school. Again, some of this will be relevant to older children too. And also what to do for teachers if you have concerns. And then I'll talk about a new study of ADHD in Wales. And there'll be a summary with some take-home messages followed by a Q&A. And we did have some pre-submitted questions which were really good, so I'll go through some of those first. Starting with some background. So ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a common condition that impacts about 1 in 20 children, so it's really common. And it's not a behavioral condition, it's a neurodevelopmental condition, which means it's related to brain development and function. It's associated with severe and developmentally inappropriate symptoms, which fall in 2 different domains, inattentive symptoms and hyperactive impulsive symptoms. And there's these 3 subtypes of ADHD, the predominantly inattentive, or sometimes also known as attention deficit disorder subtype, hyperactive impulsive subtype, and the combined subtype, which is associated with prominent difficulties in both of these domains. To be diagnosed with ADHD, a young person has to have had some symptoms at least in childhood before they were 12. So if an adult is being considered for diagnosis, they have to have evidence of symptoms in childhood as well. And the symptoms need to be present across different settings, so not just at home, but also in a variety of settings, and they have to impact on daily functioning, for example, with education or employment for adults, and also things like social functioning. One of the important features of ADHD is that it is very highly heritable, so genetic factors explain a large proportion of the likelihood of someone developing ADHD. And ADHD is not just a childhood condition. It impacts children and many children continue to have difficulties as adults, so they persist. ADHD persists in 2 out of 3 children. It's also a neurodevelopmental condition, as I mentioned, which means that it's also linked to other neurodevelopmental conditions or, under this neurodiversity umbrella. So children with ADHD often also have co-occurring autism, learning difficulties, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and other neurodevelopmental conditions, as well as neuropsychological impairments such as working memory or executive functioning difficulties. It's also a risk factor for developing later mental health difficulties, including anxiety, depression, self-harm, substance misuse, as well as more severe mental illness like bipolar disorder or psychosis. It's associated with lower educational attainment and being more likely to have school absences and be excluded. And it's also associated with various social and occupational difficulties. For example, relationship problems, peer rejection, being a victim of bullying, experiencing unemployment and criminality. And it's associated with general health issues like sleep problems, smoking, poor health, and premature mortality from accidents and suicide. So we really need to support young people with ADHD early on to try and mitigate and prevent some of these outcomes. So in terms of how we support young people with ADHD, obviously recognition is the first step, and then referral for potential assessment and diagnosis, followed by support. But actually we can bypass this, while someone's on the waiting list, which right now the waiting times are quite substantial, we can already start providing supports even in the absence of diagnosis if there are prominent difficulties recognized. So teachers play an important role, particularly when recognizing whether a child may need referral and assessment and providing appropriate educational support, but also in communicating with parents and carers to understand what the difficulties may be like at home and how they differ between home and school, for example. A diagnosis is necessary for medical treatment, so we know that ADHD medication can be highly effective for some young people. It can improve educational and occupational outcomes and reduce a variety of risks, including suicide, substance use, accidents, and criminality. But medication is not necessarily mandated in all children, or appropriate for all children. From my perspective, the research that I focus on, I'm really interested in sex differences and the fact that ADHD is much more commonly diagnosed in boys compared to girls in childhood. But by sort of young adulthood, we see actually that there's more of a 50-50 split, that there are quite a lot of women who are being diagnosed later on in life. And so there's this delay in ADHD diagnosis in many girls and young women. And even when they are diagnosed, girls are less likely to be prescribed stimulant medication for ADHD. So they do miss out on some access to early supports and treatments. So this is a graph from some of the work from my research team looking at ADHD in young people in Wales. We used the SAIL data bank, which is an electronic health record linkage that's been anonymized. And we looked at young people who had ADHD diagnosed in Wales in sort of the last 20-ish years. And we found that there were over 3,000 females and over 13,000 males who had a diagnosis of ADHD. And the females were much more likely to be diagnosed after the age of 12 compared to males. So nearly half of females were diagnosed in secondary school or onwards, as opposed to about a third of males. And females were more likely to be diagnosed after age 18 compared to males. Like with other samples, we also found that females were less likely to be prescribed stimulant medication compared to males. We also looked at other co-occurring mental health conditions, and we found that in those with ADHD, nearly a third of females had co-occurring anxiety, which was much more than males. We also found a greater likelihood of depression diagnoses in females compared to males. And when we looked at other mental health, which I've listed on the bottom in red, we also found a higher proportion of females had various mental health conditions compared to males. Antidepressants were more likely to be prescribed in females with ADHD compared to males with ADHD. And when we looked at the timing to see what was diagnosed first, we found that in individuals who had ADHD and anxiety, the anxiety was more likely to be recognized first and then the ADHD in females compared to males. And this was also true for depression, as well as other mental health difficulties and prescription of antidepressant medications. So this suggests that other mental health conditions are being potentially recognized earlier and perhaps overshadowing ADHD diagnosis in females more so often than in males. I know this is a slide that is some preliminary work that hasn't been published yet, which is under peer review. So it's a little bit of a sneak peek from our team. And we were interested in asking the question of what happens to girls who are missed and not diagnosed in early childhood. So we looked at females who were diagnosed in primary school, kind of ages 5 to 11, in blue on these graphs, compared to females who were diagnosed later, after age 12, in yellowy orange on these graphs, compared to females who did not have ADHD. And on the left, we have data from primary school. On the right is in secondary school. And we looked at exam failure at the key stages, as well as school absences. And what we can see is that the females who were diagnosed earlier were very likely to have exam failure in key stages 1 and 2, much more so than the females who were diagnosed later. But those who were diagnosed later were more likely to have exam failure compared to the girls who did not have ADHD. School absences were similar in the earlier and later diagnosed groups and higher than those in females without ADHD. So that was in primary school. In secondary school, we see a very similar pattern for the key stages 3 and 4 failure, as well as passing key stage 4 exams, but with a low grade. But for school absences, we actually see that the later diagnosed group are more likely to be absent from school. So overall, we're finding that girls who are diagnosed with ADHD earlier have more educational problems than those diagnosed later, which makes sense. But the girls diagnosed later have more problems than girls without ADHD, even though they're, so this is in childhood, even though they have not been recognized as having ADHD at that point. So they're being missed. What's not shown on these graphs in other bits of the analyses that we've done is that by adolescence, when we look at mental health, we find that depression, self-harm, substance misuse, and other mental health difficulties are worst in girls who are diagnosed later compared to girls who are diagnosed earlier and girls without ADHD diagnoses, suggesting that these outcomes are worse if they are missed in childhood. So you might be wondering, why is ADHD being missed in girls and young women? I wrote a review article about this. You can scan the QR code and find the details online at the Lancet Psychiatry. And in this article, I focused on thinking about what biological or sociocultural factors may be interacting with our diagnostic practices and services to really try and think about how this is influencing expression, recognition, and diagnosis of ADHD in males and females. And I've already mentioned diagnostic overshadowing, the possibility that things like anxiety and depression, other mental health difficulties may be kind of overshadowing or hiding underlying ADHD, more so in females than males. Other possibilities are that there's biases and stereotypes and lack of awareness of ADHD in females. And there might be differing symptom manifestations. So basically that ADHD might look a bit different in boys and girls. And our diagnostic criteria and assessment tools are biased towards males because that's what the samples were in the 90s when these were being developed, and in later years as well. So potentially we're missing some of those subtle presentations of ADHD in girls, and those are not being picked up. But we need to improve timely diagnosis and outcomes because earlier recognition and diagnosis leads to better support and improved outcomes. So how do we recognize ADHD? On this slide, I've listed our diagnostic criteria for ADHD. So we've got those two domains, attention difficulties, or what we call inattention, and hyperactivity and impulsivity. So attention difficulties include things like difficulty of paying attention to particular details, making a lot of mistakes, difficulty holding attention on to tasks and activities for a sustained amount of time, seeming not to listen, struggling to follow through on instructions, trouble organizing things, tasks and activities, avoiding or disliking tasks that require sort of sustained mental effort, losing things, being easily distracted, and forgetful. Hyperactivity and impulsivity involves things like fidgeting or squirming in one seat, leaving a seat when the remaining seating is expected, running about or climbing when it's not appropriate, being unable to play quietly, often being on the go, acting as if driven by a motor, trouble waiting for one's turn, talking excessively, blurting out answers to questions, and interrupting or intruding on others. It's a whole range of symptoms that a lot of people experience sometimes, but for these to be recognized as being kind of clinically diagnosable, the symptoms need to occur often. They need to have a negative impact, particularly on things like academic or social functioning. And they also need to be present in multiple settings. So usually for diagnosis in childhood, they need to be present at home and at school or in school after school clubs. We're interested in our team to think about whether there's sex differences in these different symptoms. So we scoured the literature and we found there was some reviews looking at total symptoms, so looking at the total number of inattention symptoms, total number of hyperactive impulsive symptoms. So these reviews have looked at all the studies that have investigated this. And they concluded that there was no evidence of sex differences in parent ratings of ADHD total scores, but that teachers rated males who had ADHD as having more hyperactivity and impulsivity than females with ADHD. So that's really interesting, but we don't know what specific symptoms they were looking at. So what we wanted to know is whether there are specific symptoms that characterize the manifestation of ADHD in females compared to males. So we did a systematic literature review. We scoured the literature, and unfortunately, we didn't find very many studies. People don't tend to study this in this level of detail. So we only found 3 studies in children and 3 in adults. And I'm just going to talk about the ones in children for now. So we found that those few studies suggested that parents were more likely to endorse certain specific inattentive symptoms in females, and particularly it was fail to sustain attention in tasks and easily distracted. And parents were more likely to endorse in males with ADHD every single hyperactive impulsive symptom on that list except for talks excessively, which showed no difference in males and females, which I think is interesting. And you'll see why when I sort of tell you about some of the results from our studies. But really more research is needed because only 3 studies had looked at that. So we did a different thing. We decided to talk to people with who were young adults who had ADHD themselves, and also parents and professionals, which I'll talk about in the next slides, to understand people's experiences of ADHD and the presentation of ADHD in young girls. We spoke to 12 individuals who were all assigned female at birth, 10 women and 2 non-binary individuals in total. And they were all aged 18 to 25 when we interviewed them. And they were diagnosed with ADHD between the ages of 15 to 23, so kind of a later diagnosed sample of individuals who took part in the study. And we conducted interviews on Zoom or in person and asked them lots of questions about their ADHD diagnosis, their primary school symptoms, things like masking and compensation, and we analyzed the data using the framework method. And here are the themes. I'm going to just move there we go. So we found that 4 themes really characterized the presentation of ADHD in females according to the information that we were given by our participants. The first theme was that the symptoms seem to be socially oriented and internalized. So a lot of the symptoms presented in a way that wasn't so much about getting things done, but about how one relates to other people. Quite a few of the symptoms were not really disruptive to others, but maybe more internal, like feelings of restlessness or difficulties with mood and feelings. So here's a quote from one participant. The hyperactivity was always mental. I'm always thinking about several things at once. And our second theme was social impact. So really highlighting that a lot of the symptoms of ADHD in females seem to have a big impact socially, particularly on friendships, but also at home and in school. So someone said, my friendships are shorter because people get frustrated because I forget about things. Our third theme was masking and compensation. And some of the sub-themes included things like being really sort of socially motivated to mask to try and fit in, various behaviors and strategies that people use to try and mask and compensate for their ADHD symptoms, but also that masking was really difficult and could lead to overcompensation and exhaustion. So one participant said, I would try so hard to fit in at school. I was constantly looking at what other people were doing to try and behave in the same way. Our fourth theme was the importance of context. So here we found that participants suggested that their symptoms varied depending on how safe and comfortable they felt, how much support they were getting from other people, how interested they were in something, how much they were enjoying it, and the sensory environment. So if something was really loud and busy, their symptoms maybe were a bit worse. One person said, I really struggle with focusing for prolonged periods of time, unless it's something that I've decided I'm incredibly interested in. So next we spoke to parents and professionals, including 11 healthcare professionals, 8 educational professionals, and 16 parents and carers. And we asked them some of the same questions. We wanted to know, again, what does the experience and presentation of ADHD in girls look like based on their lived experience and their professional experience. And this is preliminary. This has not been published. So this is, again, a sneak peek of data that we've been preparing. So we identified 4 themes that characterize the data, with slightly different themes to the previous paper. And one of them was the social impact of attention regulation difficulties. So we found that there was very prominent attention regulation difficulties identified by the parents and professionals. And a lot of the impact from that, again, was very social. So one parent said, I think she really struggles with those friendship connections. And I think some of it's because she's inattentive. Our second theme was that hyperactivity and impulsivity manifest more verbally than physically. So if you recall those symptoms that I showed, a lot of them were quite physical, running about, climbing. So parents and professionals were saying that actually a lot of the hyperactivity and impulsivity was more to do with how people were talking and relating to others rather than their physical behavior. So one person said, the hyperness in girls are often coming out on the speed and language side as excessive chattiness rather than excessive movement and fidgeting. Our third theme was prominent difficulties with emotional impulsivity and regulation. Now, this isn't part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, but it was really highlighted by a lot of the parents and professionals as being quite relevant to female ADHD. One person said, I feel like the girls that I've worked with in primary school are emotional time bombs. Our fourth theme was that difficulties are more obvious at home than at school. And this was highlighted especially by the parents. So one parent said, the second that she's outside of that school building, all of the emotions come out, the real child, as I like to call it, appears. So we're getting a little bit of a picture of what ADHD may look like in females from these studies. But just a quick note about emotional regulation. So emotional regulation is someone's ability to manage their feelings, how they express them, and how they calm down. And there are different types of difficulties. Things like temper tantrums would count, also taking a long time to get over when someone's upset. But as I mentioned, they're not part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. We have inattentive and hyperactive impulsive domains. But children with ADHD are much more likely to have difficulties of emotional regulation than children without ADHD. But they're not unique to ADHD. They're also associated with other neurodevelopmental conditions like autism and other mental health difficulties like depression. So we do need to better understand what is the link between ADHD and specific emotional regulation difficulties. And this is something that's ongoing. I just wanted to flag up that it was coming out from the research, but we don't fully understand the link yet. So back to the list. So based on what parents, professionals, and the young adults themselves have been telling us, some of the really kind of key hyperactive impulsive symptoms are these talking excessively, blurting out answers, interrupting or intruding on others. These kind of verbally hyperactive impulsive symptoms may be particularly strongly linked to ADHD in girls. And also, we had a lot of highlighting of difficulties with maintaining friendships, suggesting the sort of social impacts are very important to pay attention to. And despite the fact that the criteria say that the symptoms do need to be present in multiple settings, it's also possible that sometimes the symptoms are more pronounced in some settings than others, so maybe more pronounced at home than at school. Another aim of our research, conducting all these qualitative studies, is to really try and identify more nuanced presentations of ADHD to try and understand what does ADHD look like. So this slide is perhaps, again, a sneak peek. It's not necessarily that these are things that are actual symptoms of ADHD, but they may be linked to ADHD based on what our participants have told us. So in terms of attention, things maybe to pay attention to consider are things like a child zoning out or daydreaming, asking a question repeatedly without listening to a reply, losing track of their thoughts during a conversation and not being able to finish what they're saying. Difficulty keeping track of time was also brought up a lot by our participants. In terms of hyperactive and impulsive behaviors, we obviously saw that running and climbing are quite sort of characteristic of ADHD, but others suggested that perhaps things like dancing, skipping, and gymnastics, like if someone's in a queue and isn't supposed to be doing dancing, skipping, and gymnastics, could be considered to be related to ADHD. Low-level fidgeting that might seem like it's socially appropriate, things like fiddling with hair, nails, jewelry, or other objects, chewing pens, nails, hair, or clothing, those could potentially be considered to be fidgeting. Also, things like quickly jumping from one idea to the next was suggested. As I mentioned, emotion regulation difficulties are not part of ADHD, but some of the specific kinds of symptoms that were brought up by our participants were things like frequent, strong emotional reactions or outbursts, acting or saying things impulsively based on emotions, being sensitive to perceived rejection or to being told off, and difficulties with calming down from intense emotions. So perhaps these things could be explored further. In terms of impact, like I mentioned, difficulty making or keeping friends is particularly a big one to pay attention to, but also things like low self-esteem and not meeting academic potential were also brought up. So next I'll move on to some tips on how to support children with ADHD. So step one really is to understand ADHD and to remember that ADHD isn't a choice, it's not a behavioral condition, it's a genetic and neurodevelopmental condition. And it's been suggested that using positive reinforcement, obviously that works with all children, but it's particularly helpful for children with ADHD. A lot of children with ADHD get a lot of criticism, a lot of kind of negativity from other people. So praising children with ADHD when they do well, focusing on their strengths, not just praising outcomes, but also their effort can be really motivating. Of course, using empathetic and compassionate language, but in general, just trying to make more positive comments than critical or corrective ones, which can help to increase the confidence of children because they do receive a lot of criticism from other people. Having a quiet space for doing kind of sustained mental work can be quite helpful. So thinking about a clutter-free area that doesn't have distractions, not just sort of sound distractions, but visual distractions like lots of colorful posters can be distracting as well. Some children find noise-canceling headphones can be helpful, particularly in noisy places. It's very important to give simple and clear instructions. Children with ADHD find it very difficult to process multiple things at the same time, or like a complex task with lots of steps. So breaking tasks into smaller, simpler steps and writing things down can be very effective. It's also important to use visual reminders, helping children to keep a diary of tasks, check it regularly, ticking off completed tasks. Options like using post-it notes, visual charts, photos, timetables, where they can see them every day, that can be helpful. And children with ADHD, one of the symptoms is that they struggle with being organized and prepared. So keeping things consistent, structured, and predictable can help. If everything has its place, it'll be easier for children to remember where the things they need are. And also before starting a task, it's helpful to assist them to gather everything they may need in advance. It's important to also remind children to take time to read instructions carefully before they get started. Some children may find highlighting keywords helpful, but also just checking in with them to make sure that they're staying on task, they understand exactly what to do. Providing short, regular breaks, say every 20 minutes if possible, but any breaks are good, just to help keep their minds fresh, let them get up, move, or stretch and have movement breaks. In order to return to a task, maybe a timer can be helpful as well. Like I said, it's very important to communicate with parents and carers as well. If there are any concerns or questions, obviously parents and carers know best what kinds of things work well with their children and what they respond to best. But also remember that ADHD is genetic to a large degree. So some parents may also have ADHD themselves, and even if they don't have ADHD, they could have some traits. So just it's important to bear that in mind. And of course, regularly reviewing individual support plans with other members of staff is also important. We've developed a booklet about ADHD at the Wolfson Center for Young People's Mental Health. This was developed by experts and includes a lot of the tips that I've just mentioned, as well as some other things. It's aimed at young people, parents, and school staff, and it can be downloaded on our website. I've got the link to our study page later, which includes this booklet, so you can have a look at it later. There's also a neurodivergent support call line in Wales, which is good if anyone's got any particular concerns related to neurodivergence. So this is a really good one to share with parents potentially as well. And I've also included a link at the bottom, just if you just Google Young Minds, they have some information about ADHD as well. I also just want to flag up some resources that are being developed by Dr. Abigail Russell at Exeter University, as well as colleagues. And they've got this Tools for Schools Flex Toolkit, which is part of their research, which has a lot of resources. There's a whole range of practical tools, for example, posters, templates, and videos to help children with a range of different kinds of difficulties related to attention and managing their emotions and energy. So yeah, it's a fantastic resource. I recommend checking it out. Other free online resources. The Learning About Neurodiversity at School page has a free program aimed at primary schools, which helps to consider how to introduce the kind of the concept of neurodiversity and neurodevelopmental conditions to pupils and how it may impact their experiences at school. Belonging in School is a resource as well about developing inclusive policies at a school level. And this article is really useful about neurodiversity affirmative education, and also has suggestions and ideas. But in general, I think a universal approach to learning can benefit all children, even if they don't have a formal ADHD diagnosis and they maybe have some perhaps subthreshold or undiagnosed difficulties. And it helps to not draw attention to specific children's difficulties as well, to kind of adapt things for everyone. So now I'll talk about a new study that we're conducting in Wales, which is leading on from all the work I've just told you about. So as I mentioned, it's important to improve timely diagnosis and outcomes to better support young people so that their outcomes are improved. So the aim of our study is to test a new assessment tool for ADHD to help identify children, especially girls, who have ADHD before the end of primary school. And so we've developed this new assessment tool based on the literature that I've already mentioned, our qualitative studies, which I've told you about, and we've also then gone through 2 rounds of co-development with our participants from our qualitative research to draft and improve on the new wording of the new items. We've also conducted publication involvement with our ADHD Parent and Youth Advisory Group, where we got more support in terms of how to conduct this study. So we're now collecting data. We just launched this study on the 1st of October, and we are recruiting parents and carers of pupils aged 9 to 11 or years 5 and 6 in Welsh primary schools. And we're looking for school staff to help us to promote the study, to share it with people so that we can reach a big sample and be able to test our assessment tool and make a difference with it. So to tell you a bit more about it, it's called the BEARS study, which stands for Behavior, Emotion, and Attention Regulation Scale. And this also has a supplement to it called BEAMS, the Behavior, Emotion, and Attention Masking and Support Scale, because masking and compensation came out from the qualitative research. So the BEARS scales includes attention, behavior, and emotion subscales, and an impact section for each one of those to look at whether attention regulation difficulties are having an impact on someone's life, etc. And the masking subscale is sort of separate, but has its own impact section. And we have parent and teacher versions, as well as a self-report version. So the aim of the study is to test and validate these new scales so that we can finalize them and then make them openly available for everyone to use. So we're looking to get the support of about 40 schools across Wales to help us to advertise the study to eligible families. So by taking part, a school will sign a research agreement, advertise the study through their usual channels of communication with families, and help us to promote the study, and they'll receive a one-off thank you payment for their administrative time. We've already had a few schools sign up this morning, which is fantastic. And we are asking to promote the study to parents and carers of children who are in years 5 and 6, so ages 9 to 11 approximately. We're looking to recruit about 400 parents and carers. And we're interested in parents and carers of children of any gender and with or without ADHD. That's important because, we need to test this assessment tool in children with and without ADHD. And we're also asking parents and carers for consent to get their children to also potentially fill out the self-report, although we're expecting that not everyone will agree to this. And similarly, we're also hoping to get some teachers to complete the assessment tool so we can compare the ratings in parents and teachers to see how things differ at home and school. Participants will get an information sheet. So we have separate information sheets for parents, carers, and children and teachers. And then consent forms, children get an assent form. And then there's a study assessment pack, which is available online or paper and pen by post. It's only in English. We need to assess what we call psychometric properties of the new assessment tools. So we need to have only a single language for that. But in future, we can develop other language versions like Welsh. And the children and teachers packs are shorter because they're really just the bears and the beans, whereas the parent pack is a little bit long with a few additional questions. We have a prize draw for £20 cash vouchers for families who take part, as well as teachers who take part. And we have about 100 vouchers available to win. Once the study ends, then we'll do a prize draw. So please do help us to spread the word about our research. We have a study video that I recorded, and it's available on our study page. So the video can be shared on YouTube, on social media, and we've got that study page, which you can click on. You can get the link. You can click on my screen. And then we've got our flyers as well in English and Welsh, which also include QR codes for the study page. The study page has information on like this sort of study information sheets for parents and carers. Oops. A link to take part in the study and various resources on ADHD. So I mentioned the booklet as well. So there's the QR code and the link again. If you're interested in the booklet, it's on the bottom of the page, so you can download that PDF. So how do you help? Well, there's sort of two options. If you work at a primary school in Wales and would like your school to sign up, please do email me, and then I'll send a school information sheet for you to read and the school research agreement, which needs to be signed by a head teacher or a kind of top administrator in the school. And we then ask you to share our study information with eligible families. So this is parents and carers of children in years 5 and 6, or around the ages of 9 to 11 years old. And the other option is just to share our study information on social media or school newsletters or anything like that. You can print a flyer and stick it up. That'd be just incredibly helpful to us. So yeah, there's no need to formally sign up, but we are asking schools to sign up if they're interested in hearing more about the project. So that's the study. So just a couple of final slides. Just to summarize, ADHD is really common, about 1 in 20 children. It has lifelong impacts and continues to persist for many young people. But there's inequality and timely access to clinical care and treatment. And in particular, girls are often missed and their outcomes can be worse as a result of this. Importantly, the presentation of ADHD might differ in girls and boys. In girls, there seems to be sort of more verbal hyperactivity and impulsivity rather than physical. The symptoms can maybe present less obviously. They're either internalized or less disruptive. Can also present potentially in terms of emotional dysregulation. There can be huge social impacts, particularly for friendships. And young people may use masking to try to minimize social impacts, but this can come at a big cost. And also symptoms can be less noticeable at school than at home, especially for girls. So our new study aims to validate a new co-developed assessment tool, which once ready will be openly available, accessible, hopefully user-friendly, focused on ADHD and gender inclusive. So our take-home messages are that we need to raise awareness of ADHD in girls and women. We need more sensitive and validated assessment tools for ADHD. We need to improve timely identification of ADHD in young girls. And so we also need to support children in primary school to improve their lifelong outcomes. And I'd just like to thank all the researchers and collaborators who supported these projects and our parent and youth advisory groups especially, as well as our funders and study participants. And this is just a list of all the different resources that I've sort of talked about throughout, which hopefully one of the comms team will paste into the chat so you can copy them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Joanna. So we'll start the Q&A. So there is a Q&A box live right now. If you want to drop some questions, we have had quite a few pre-submitted, so we'll start with those now. So our first question is, how closely linked are autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, and what are the main symptoms and signs to look for?
Yeah, so this is actually what my PhD was about some years ago. So ADHD and autism are quite closely linked. They're both neurodevelopmental conditions. and they do often co-occur in young people. And this is partly because there's actually a genetic link between them to some extent. But they are quite different. And one of the main features of autism to look out for is things like difficulties with social communication, such as finding it hard to make friends, or to be, preferring to be on your own, or difficulties with eye contact. Another feature of autism is a greater need for kind of routine and repetition. So this can be things like getting very upset when something in kind of the expected routine changes, or being very sensitive to sort of sensory things like smells, touch, bright lights. Also things like having very intense interests in particular topics. So it co-occurs quite often, but it is actually quite distinct in terms of the symptoms and signs.
That's great. Thank you so much. So the next question is from Rebecca. Do you think ADHD is harder to spot with combined autistic traits? And if so, how can diagnosis adapt to consider this?
Yeah, I guess this could go either way, really. So in children who have substantial difficulties in terms of both ADHD and autism, in a way, it can be easier to spot that the child is struggling, that there's something going on because there's multiple things going on. So spotting that something's off, and that they need some sort of additional support is a bit easier, and then getting them referred and assessed. But on the other hand, if children have more kind of prominent symptoms of inattention, which are harder to spot than the hyperactive impulsive symptoms, then I guess having combined autistic traits and inattention, maybe the inattention is less obvious, so it might be a bit harder to spot. Luckily in Wales, we have these joined up neurodevelopmental services. So there are specialist psychiatrists and doctors who are trained to identify both ADHD and autism. And so I think these two conditions should be considered alongside each other.
Amazing, thanks so much. So the next question is there any moves to have deficit implications in ADHD reframed to be more in keeping with current thinking of it being a difference than a deficit?
Yeah, this is a really good, timely question because there are ongoing discussions about this issue, especially among researchers and clinicians working on ADHD, and obviously people with lived experience as well. So we generally think of ADHD as falling under this neurodiversity umbrella. And the difficulties of children and young people with ADHD can be resulting from this kind of insufficient support and insufficient adaptations in the environment. So it's not so much that there's something going on with them, it's more that the environment isn't very well suited to their differences. But I guess ADHD currently does require a formal diagnosis, like a medical diagnosis by specialist services. And some children do benefit greatly from treatment with medications, although obviously not everyone. So the medical approach to ADHD does have a place, and it can support and help young people to kind of access specialist supports. But I actually think these two kind of issues of, is ADHD a condition that needs to be diagnosed, or is it a difference that is sort of, just present in the population? They can kind of coexist side by side. It really just depends on how much support someone needs and how to access that support best. And I suppose it's also important to emphasize this reduction of stigma that may be associated with like a label, but focusing more on increasing support and understanding for people with ADHD.
Thank you so much. So the next question is how to distinguish between ADHD and anxiety-driven behavior?
Yeah, this is a really good question because some of the symptoms of anxiety can look a little bit similar to ADHD. So if someone's very anxious, they might have a lot of difficulty in concentrating, or they might sort of show fidgety type behaviors, feeling kind of restless. And these are obviously features of ADHD. However, the main features of the main features of anxiety really are kind of worrying and being fearful. And obviously these are not directly part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, so they're different. Also, anxiety is often linked to other things like avoiding certain places, certain situations, certain people. So that kind of anxious, worrying, and avoidant behavior is sort of really the main kind of features of some types of anxiety. Also, anxiety can be linked to physical symptoms like stomach aches or headaches or that kind of thing. But I guess the thing to really bear in mind is that ADHD and anxiety do often co-occur. One can precede the other, one can lead to the other. So a detailed evaluation by a specialist is really needed to determine kind of what specific support a child needs and what diagnoses they meet the criteria for.
Great. And our next question is, if a child functions well day to day, isn't getting left behind with studies, is happy and interacts well socially, what are the benefits of getting a diagnosis?
Yeah, well, I guess as I mentioned, the diagnostic criteria require that there's some level of impact on daily functioning. So if a child, who has ADHD symptoms is actually doing really well day to day, and that's wonderful. Some children can manage very well in the right supportive environment. That's fantastic. So in order to get the diagnosis, there has to be evidence of some kind of negative impact on daily functioning. Otherwise, a child wouldn't meet the diagnostic criteria. But it's also important to bear in mind that for some children, the impact just might be kind of less obvious. For example, if a child is, very, very intelligent or, emotionally intelligent, and they're just doing quite well, like say they're doing okay in school, they're passing and things like that, but maybe they're not quite reaching their potential. So, a teacher thinks, oh, they could do better, but they're not quite doing as well as I think they should be doing. Then that might be some evidence of impact, but it's not to the point where people are actively worrying about, say, educational failure or anything like that. So I guess for some children, there might be these low-level impacts, say in primary school, but perhaps they get worse, or the impacts get bigger as a child gets older and demands increase. So sometimes the earlier diagnosis could help to support them, or at least, some supports can be put in place before problems get too big. So I guess it's a case of, is there really no impact, and, what else is going on? And is the child kind of in a stable friendship group, or does it look like they have lots of friends, but actually, they don't have close, sustained friendships? So I think it's thinking about kind of the more subtle impact as well.
And the next question is, how important do you think it is for teaching staff to offer physical embodied activities, not just writing or sitting, as part of regular opportunities to move and recalibrate?
Yeah, I guess this is something that I don't know too much about. I'm not an educator, I'm a researcher, but I do think that regular movement breaks and using a diverse range of activities can be helpful for children, even with that, regardless of whether they have ADHD. So I think that kind of rich environment with sort of these more kind of physical activities, in addition to sort of traditional classroom sort of writing or sitting, can be quite helpful, I think.
Thank you so much. So our next question from Fiona, are there additional ways to identify ADHD when working remotely with children?
I guess remote working and, remote learning with children comes with many different challenges. So teachers have, say, a lot less control over the learning environment. There might be additional distractions that can be happening for the child, which, can't do anything about. But I suppose the symptoms to keep an eye out for would just be the same kinds of things that I've covered in the talk. So, can the child stay on task and in their seat and that kind of thing? Yeah.
Thank you. And our next one is, in practice, what does a gold standard assessment of ADHD look like? And what disciplines are involved? And what role does each discipline take?
Yeah, so I guess in Wales, in the NHS, ADHD assessments happen in specialist secondary neurodevelopmental services. So there'll be, a range of different medical professionals involved. Typically, a psychiatrist actually, gives the diagnosis and does the main assessment. And this is partly because any treatment with medication for ADHD needs to be carefully calibrated and monitored for individuals. There's, a lot of kind of things to look out for, like general health related issues. But I guess the specific assessment tools might vary a little bit, but they'll include, well-validated measures of ADHD that have been tested and used clinically for years. And the assessment will typically involve kind of in-depth interviews, clinical interviews with parents and carers, information from schools. If a young person is a bit older, they will also be asked, to take part in the clinical interviews. Yeah.
Thank you. Can food that contains additives, high sugar, or other artificial ingredients impact a child's brain development? Could such foods contribute to conditions like ADHD?
So as far as I'm aware, there's no strong evidence that any of these things cause ADHD. The strongest known factor for kind of likelihood of developing ADHD, as I mentioned, is genetics. The heritability is about 70 to 80%, so it's a very strongly genetic condition. But there are also a few very early life adversity factors, things like very premature birth, that can lead to ADHD. But as far as I'm aware, there's no sort of good evidence for specific environmental risk factors like sugar or artificial kind of food additives that actually causing ADHD. So R. Perry says, I had a girl assessed for ADHD and the parent was told that she is not ADHD, but is definitely hyperkinetic disorder. Is this a diagnosis, as in is HD on its own part of ADHD? So hyperkinetic disorder is just the ICD name for ADHD. So we use two diagnostic manuals to diagnose ADHD, the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is kind of originally American, and the ICD, International Classification of Diseases, which is European. And for a long, long time, hyperkinetic disorder was the ICD name, but that has now since changed and everyone just calls it ADHD. So I don't quite understand why someone would say she's not ADHD and has hyperkinetic disorder, because they're very, very similar. The diagnostic criteria was sort of subtly different over the years, but they're more similar these days. And then the next question, L. Owens, is it possible to mask all symptoms in school? We have a child in our school that doesn't show any symptoms, and as a result, the doctor has not given the girl a diagnosis because of the school's response to the questionnaire we received. Parents are angry about this. So obviously I can't comment on the specific individual and what to do in that situation, but I think the question of, is it possible to mask all symptoms in school, we don't really know the answer to. There's, I suppose, a lot we don't know about masking in ADHD, and one of the kind of interesting things coming out of the research is that even when children appear to successfully mask, actually it comes at a cost, and it causes a lot, it takes a lot of energy to mask. So if children spend a lot of the time masking at school, then at home they're so tired that they're unable to mask, and maybe that's when they have a lot more difficulties. So yeah, I suppose perhaps in certain contexts, in certain scenarios, certain individuals can do quite a bit of masking, but we don't know yet exactly how much masking children with ADHD do and how effective this is. And then the next question, Amanda Jones, when features of ADHD are significant and pronounced, what would be the earliest age for which a formal assessment could be undertaken? So I'm not 100% sure about this, because I think this does vary a little bit, but you can diagnose ADHD before the age of 5 in preschool. I think the NICE guidelines do allow for that, so long as there's sufficient evidence of difficulties. But the thing to kind of note is that ADHD is, the symptoms need to be kind of considered developmentally inappropriate. So when someone's very, very young, it's sort of perhaps harder to assess that. In toddlers. So I think generally kind of the greater certainty of diagnosis comes with sort of slightly older children, but I think in certain situations it is possible to diagnose ADHD younger, like by pediatricians. Next question, R. Davis, what are some of the side effects of ADHD medications? I mean, like with any medications, there's enormous side effect lists, and everyone is different. I think there's a lot of different kinds of ADHD medications as well. So psychiatrists spend a lot of time trying to adapt a suitable medication to each individual to kind of make sure the dose is correct and how it's administered, and if it's the timing and everything like that, to try and mitigate those symptoms. And this is why there's so much the medical side of things for ADHD is so important. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't know too much more about that. And of course, those decisions need to be made by doctors. Cheryl Odgers, is there a link crossover with FASD? I'm not sure what that is. Is that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? I'm going to go with, I think that's what it is. But yes, if it is fetal alcohol spectrum conditions, then I think it is there is a link. That is one of those conditions that has a large effect on the brain and brain development. So it can influence attention regulation processes. Oh, I see. Gita's actually added that. Yes, I was correct. Yeah, so there is a link there, but it's like with sort of prematurity, extreme prematurity. It's obviously it's a rare thing. Katrin L. Rees, is there any research to suggest that ADHD is connected with tics and Tourette syndrome? Yes, so as I mentioned, ADHD being part of this neurodevelopmental umbrella, it's associated with a whole range of different neurodevelopmental conditions, not just autism, which people often talk about, but also various learning difficulties, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, tics, and Tourette syndrome. They're all kind of, if you have one of these neurodevelopmental conditions, the likelihood of having another is increased. So they are linked. And again, that's like with autism, it's perhaps partly due to some shared biological or genetic factors. There's another question. Katie Perry, you mentioned that diet does not cause ADHD, but is there research about any impact of diet on an individual with ADHD? I'm sure there is, but I'm afraid I don't know. That's not my area, so I don't know about that side of things, sorry. I think that's all the questions I've seen. Have I missed any? Has anyone else got anything? Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I hope you found this interesting and useful. And if you have any questions about the research study, please do email me. I'm very happy to provide more information. And if your school wants to sign up, obviously I can send the information sheet and the research agreement and that kind of thing. So thank you very much.